Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's wonderful to see some familiar names, and welcome to anyone who is joining these webinar series for the first time. I'm Don Kinzler, the NDSU horticulture agent here in Cass County, coming to you this evening from my office here. And well, this evening, this is our third in our series of Monday evening webinars. And this evening, we're going to talk about selecting shrubs for our yards and landscapes. And so what we're going to do this evening is almost pretend that we're at a garden center in the shrub section and looking at all the different types of shrubs. And we're going to kind of go through each one, and hopefully you can make a few notes here and there. So I hope you've got a pencil and paper handy, because maybe some of the types you'll notice that maybe you can use in your own landscape or yard. So it'll take just a minute before we get to some of the actual names of some of the shrubs. So in the meantime, if you want to grab yourself a paper and pencil, that would be great. And this evening, if you have any questions, we'll handle those at the end. And so you can use either the chat or the Q&A box. I'll be checking both of those. So again, thank you very much for joining me. These webinars, I really enjoy them. And thank you to all of you who do join in live. There are 144 of you. And joining live always gives us a chance to kind of interact and answer some questions at the end. So I really appreciate you joining in. So thank you. And of course, shrubbery. What would our homes and our farmsteads and our cities be like without landscaping? Trees, certainly, to give a shade protection, but also what would they be without the shrubs that make our house foundations look so nice, and even the backyards, the side yards. There's so many beautiful things that we can accomplish through shrubbery. Isn't that a beautiful landscape? That's not my backyard, but I really wish it was. That's beautiful. Now, of course, the importance of choosing shrubs wisely and foundation plantings is because it's easy to make mistakes. And as I always say, I'm a good one to talk about mistakes in gardening because I've made most of them. This isn't a planting I did, but I've done similar. I've planted things, shrubs in spots where they maybe didn't have enough room. So I've made mistakes. And so looking at the size of a shrub, the type of a shrub, can help us avoid some mistakes that we might regret later on. Well, let's talk about what exactly do we mean by a shrub? What exactly is that? Well, there's not really a firm and fast botanical definition of a shrub, but in kind of gardening terms, we talk about a shrub as being a woody plant that has more than one branches coming from the base, as opposed to a tree, which has one main trunk, or maybe it's a multiple trunked tree. But generally, a shrub, of course, has the foliage and branches all the way down and rounded. So, it's interesting. Some things are kind of crossovers. We're going to take a look at those. Some of them, you aren't sure if they're just kind of a large shrub or a small shrubby tree. But anyway, generally, when we're talking about shrubs, that's the type of thing we're looking at, that generally the foliage is kind of all the way to the ground and they're multi-stemmed. So we're going to get right into talking about some of these different shrubs. And of course, the first one there is one of those that's almost kind of like a crossover. It's called Amur maple, kind of a crossover as to whether it is that kind of a small tree, a shrubby tree. But that Amur maple, it can also be grown as just a large shrub where the branches are almost down to the ground like that. Now, the order that we're going to cover these shrubs, there's kind of a logical order to these. And all shrubs, trees, in fact, all plants have a botanical name to them. That's a kind of Latin sounding name. And so I've kind of ranked these in order. Now, this isn't the tree and shrub class that I took in college, so we don't have to memorize all these. But there's a good reason for knowing at least where to find some of these Latin names. So we'll talk about a particular shrub where it does become very important. Most of the rest of these, the Latin name is, the botanical name is kind of there for us to reference. But there's a good case for at least being aware that there are botanical names. And here's the reason. If we talk to somebody in Canada and they say, boy, you ought to plant a Saskatoon. And well, we think, what is a Saskatoon? And they said, well, okay, look it up. The botanical genus is Amelanchier. And so I looked that up and oh, it's Juneberry. It's our native Juneberry. But in Canada, they call it the Saskatoon or sometimes the serviceberry. And we might not have any idea what they're talking about. But when we can all converse with that universal language called the botanical names, I could talk to somebody in Germany and I have no idea what the Juneberry common name is in German, but we could all talk about Amelanchier. So anyway, the order in which these are arranged is actually by their botanical species, but that's okay. We aren't going to get into that until there's one particular shrub where it becomes really important. So, there's different ways a person could group talking about shrubs. We could talk about height, and I'll mention the height as we go along. So anyway, let's get right into it. Again, as I mentioned, the Amur maple, A-M-U-R, Amur maple. It's a kind of a small tree or a very large shrub. There are different named varieties of this. At the very end of our program, we're going to talk about some NDSU introductions, and there's a really nice Amur maple. But look at the color that gets in the fall of the year. Almost unbeatable. Amur maple likes our soil from the Red River Valley on west. It likes our soil better than many of the other maples do. And so this gives us a very nice fall color, and it's quite well adapted, fully hardy, and a nice, very large shrub. Now, I can picture this as a screening type large shrub in the back corner of one's yard. If you're maybe want a little privacy, Amur maple, the type, the shrub type with multiple trunks like that, gives quite good screening. All right, next, we're still in the maple group. The botanical name for anybody that's just kind of curious is Acer, A-C-E-R. And that's why we're starting alphabetical with those. But anyway, hot wings Tatarian maple. Isn't that pretty? Those almost look like flowers. But those are the seed, those are the seed pods on the Tatarian maple. Now this becomes a large shrub or small tree, depending on how you prune it. And again, a screening type tree. Sometimes you'll notice these as you're going around town. It's a relatively new cultivar of kind of a shrubby, small tree type maple. And it will look from the street, all the world, like those are flowers. But again, those are the winged seed carrier pods. All right. So next we go on to the one I talked about with a common name that the Canadians call it the Saskatoon or serviceberry. We know it as the Juneberry. There are different varieties of Juneberry, and these are a large shrub. If you pruned it down to one trunk, they could be even a small tree, but usually they're grown as a very large shrub. Now, these would be good for screening, giving a little privacy towards the backyard or the side yard. Plus, they produce the very, very tasty berries. These are called the blueberry of the north. Blueberries, of course, the little shrub is not well adapted to the Red River Valley and on west into North Dakota because they need a very acid type soil. So blueberries will grow very well in northern Minnesota, but not very well in North Dakota. So, but we could plant a Juneberry. Very pretty. There are different varieties too. When you go to the garden center looking for Juneberry, you'll find different named cultivars, and they were selected primarily to have a little bigger fruit than the native wild Juneberry. And this is one of my favorite shrubs. It's called Aronia. Aronia. Now, it's got a kind of what I consider a terrible secondary common name called chokeberry. Now, this isn't to be confused with chokecherry, which is one of our native fruits. So I never use that term chokeberry because it just sounds awful. And so I like Aronia. Now, Aronia makes a very beautiful landscape shrub. It will become a height of, oh, maybe 4, maybe 5 feet, nice rounded green shrub. And in the fall of the year, look at the color on that. And it yields berries. The Aronia fruit are edible, very edible, not just edible. They are one of the highest fruits in antioxidants. They're a little tart for eating fresh. Until they're just fully ripe. Then I enjoy eating them right off the shrub. We've got one of these on the corner of our porch. And so maybe not so good for fresh eating for everybody, but you should taste my wife Mary's Aronia berry muffins. They are delicious. And you can mix these in apple crisp and all kinds of different recipes. If you do an online search of Aronia recipes, you'll find all kinds of good ways. This last year on our Aronia shrub, again, it's maybe 5 feet tall at most, we got about 2 ice cream buckets full of these berries. So we had plenty for the freezer. Great double duty landscaping shrub, Aronia. During the growing season, it has a very nice clean green leaf, a few insects, disease problems. Okay, next we go on to barberry. Barberry, there's a couple of different types of, in fact, when you go to the garden center, you'll find different named cultivars. So we've got the red leaf barberry with kind of the purplish. I should mention too that the shrubs that we go through tonight are kind of a oh, I don't know, what would you call it? Kind of the basic introduction to these. There are so many named varieties. In barberry alone, we could probably list, I don't know, I suppose there's 20 or 25 different named cultivars of barberry. But this evening, our main goal is probably to just kind of at least look at the basic types so that a person might say, oh yeah, that barberry, that does have a very nice color tone to it. Now, barberries will differ a little bit in height. There's some little miniature type that will only get maybe a foot or two high. Others will get up to about 3 feet. But at the garden center, we can look at the tag and find the height that will do well for us. But generally, barberries are considered a kind of a low or medium growing shrub. There are also some very nice bright lemon yellow, light greenish yellow. Isn't that a pretty one? Person does see that along many buildings. It looks very nice in a row. Or for extra contrast, picture the two of those barberries in kind of next to one another. Wouldn't the deep purple and the bright lime yellow-green leaves, wouldn't that look nice in contrast together? Barberry. Okay, next we go on to boxwood. Boxwood, the genus is actually Buxus. You know, it's interesting. Some of the genus botanical names are kind of similar to the common name. Now, boxwood is one you'll sometimes see sold at chain stores, some garden centers, but this is not fully adapted to widespread planting in the Red River Valley and on west. It winter burns quite easily. The boxwood it's actually an evergreen, not the evergreens like we know of, like Christmas tree type evergreens, but they've got little wide leaves and they stay green and hang on. And so that's why they oftentimes winter burn during winter. But this is the type of shrub that is oftentimes used in formal hedges. When you see a formal trimmed European or Eastern American hedge, oftentimes it is the box. And one thing that makes a shrub a good hedge type shrub, where you plant that continuous and then trim, is very small leaves. So when you go along with your hedge trimmer and do trimming, you aren't making a bunch of big ragged leaves. Instead, the small leaves, the very fine leaves, you can trim them and they fill in quite nicely. But anyway, boxwood is very, very kind of borderline in adaptation. But in a minute, I'm going to show you something that is a better version of a hedge than boxwood. Next is Globe Carigana. It looks like that picture's a little bit fuzzy, but Globe Carigana grows in just a neat round mound, fully winter hardy. It's a zone 3, toughest nails. We've got Globe Carigana planted fairly close together in a hedge around our back porch. They only get maybe at most 3 to 4 feet in height. And they make just a neat round mound like that and planted close together, then you get a solid little hedge. And because they don't get very tall, you're not continually having to prune them down. They make a nice informal hedge. And garden centers do sell Globe Carigana. The parent of that, the Carigana, was used a lot for windbreaks and still is. It makes quite a large, 15, 18 feet tall windbreak if you don't trim them. But anyway, this is the small, neat version called Globe Carigana. Next, we move on to dogwoods. Now, the picture there is of the variegated dogwood. And of course, variegated means that the leaves are the two-tone. In this case, the variegated dogwood is green leaf and with white margins. Very, very pretty. Now, there are different named versions of this. Some are taller than others. That's the main way that they vary. The standard variegated dogwood can probably get easily 6 feet high and 6 feet wide and a great big shrub, maybe for the corners of a planting or somewhere where you've got lots of space. Now, there are smaller versions of that. And so at the garden center, you would look to see what the height and width would be, whether you want the tall version or one that's a little more compact. Oh, and the dogwoods, especially the one called red twig dogwood from the garden centers. Imagine those bright red twigs against the snow. They are absolutely beautiful. And there are some named varieties of the dogwood that are especially noted for the bright red twigs. And on the tags, you'll see that. That'll be one of the main selling points is they'll say bright red twigs in the winter landscape. All right, next we're moving on to the Cotoneaster. Now, sometimes if you looked at that word, you might think it's cotton Easter. And that's kind of a logical mispronunciation, cotton Easter, but actually it's pronounced Cotoneaster. And the Cotoneaster, that's also the botanical genus of that plant. Now, remember I talked about the box that made those nice, neat hedges, but not really winter hardy or adapted for widespread. There are some around the area, but for widespread planting, they tended to burn too much. But this is our version of that, Cotoneaster. This is probably the plant that has been, the shrub that has been used for hedges most in the last 50, 60, 70 years in our area. It has a small leaf, and so it shears very nicely. You can make a very nice formal hedge from that. Now, Cotoneaster is in the rose family. It's a relative of apple, and it is subject to fire blight disease. But we haven't had, at least in the Fargo area, we have not had outbreaks of fire blight for a while. So I'm not seeing infestations of fire blight bacteria disease that has caused Cotoneaster to not be planted. So you'll find this at the garden centers, Cotoneaster. Now, one tip about that, if you ever are growing a formal hedge like that, this hedge isn't sheared in the recommended way. The recommended is to taper it so that the top is narrower than the bottom. Think pyramidal, okay, a flat-topped pyramid. And the reason for that is if you shear a hedge straight down like this, eventually the bottom is going to get shaded out and it starts losing its leaves and the hedge becomes leggy and spindly at the bottom. Instead, if you taper it upward like a flat-topped pyramid, the bottom area will get more sunlight because it's sticking out slightly wider, and it will retain those leaves. If you ever tour the hedge section at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, I think they've got something like I don't know, is it 70 or 80 different types of hedges? And if you take a look at the end profile, they're all tapered that way so that the bottom is wider. Formal hedges are making kind of a comeback again. In the fall of the year, this Cotoneaster hedge is being trimmed kind of maintained in a less formal habit. But look at the fall color on Cotoneaster, beautiful. All right, next we move to a shrub called Diervilla, also known as bush honeysuckle, Diervilla. Now, a person does need to be a little cautious of this. We've got this planted in our front yard, kind of along the porch. And when I say need to be a little cautious, it's a nice 3 foot high, but it does spread. It does send up shoots and keeps kind of going. And beautiful red fall color. But a person would want to put this in a spot where you can use that spread to an advantage. For example, if you maybe had a corner somewhere where you'd like it to fill in and don't mind if it travels a little bit, but keep in mind that the neighbor maybe doesn't want this spreading into his yard. So again, it does not spread weedy. It's being used a lot in areas. The University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, I see it used very effectively there. So Diervilla or bush honeysuckle. Next, we move on to the euonymus burning bush. Burning bush, there are different varieties. There's a dwarf and a taller one. The dwarf, probably 5 feet. The regular burning bush can easily get way over head high. I suppose, I don't know, 8 or 9 feet, a big shrub. The reason they're called burning bush is because in the fall of the year, they develop that just a brilliant, kind of a pinkish scarlety red. They are absolutely beautiful. One of the best shrubs in our area for that fall color. Rabbits do love them, especially when they're tiny. Rabbits will go after them. So a person does need to do some winter protection on them. They've got a fascinating twig too. Look closely at the twigs. They kind of have a ridge, almost like a square. The twigs are almost square with these kind of prominent ridges and beautiful. Euonymus burning bush, that entire family of euonymus are very pretty. That would look really nice. They're a larger shrub, so maybe somewhere along the side yard or backyard or along the house foundation where you wanted something large enough. Forsythia, isn't that beautiful? Now, those are the flowers, and Forsythia sends out its flowers in early spring before the leaves even pop out. And so it's so dynamic. It's fun when we drive around our cities, you can spot a Forsythia a mile away. And that's kind of a sure sign that spring is coming. The soil has warmed up. So hopefully the Forsythia aren't blooming yet. I haven't seen any, those that I commonly see on my drive to work, because we don't want them blooming yet. It's sure to get pretty chilly and that would freeze the flowers off. They bloom just in the spring, but man, isn't it well worth that? There are different varieties, especially for our northern climates. Meadowlark is one that was developed at NDSU, a very beautiful. If it's not a northern hardy variety, one developed for here, sometimes you'll see that they only bloom in the area that was under the snow line, under snow protection, because the snow gave insulation to the flower buds, and the part that was stuck up above the snow sometimes has no flowers on. And so rather than ordering or buying just any Forsythia, look for a winter hardy one, such as the Meadowlark Forsythia. They can become fairly large, I suppose around 5 feet or so. If ever they become overly woody and no longer blooming as well as they once did, there's an easy way to get them back in full gear, and that is to cut them back. Cut them back quite dramatically in early spring, and they won't bloom that year. But what they do is send out a whole bunch of nice new fresh twigs that are more capable of blooming than the following year. See, sometimes when the shrubs get too old and woody, then they just don't flower as well on some of that wood. So Forsythia, Meadowlark especially. Now, Hydrangea, isn't that beautiful? The hydrangea with the big white rounded blossoms that does so well in the shade, so beautiful. Now, remember when I mentioned that there is especially one type of shrub where it's important to know what that botanical name is. Okay, and this is the one, hydrangea, and you'll see in a minute. Okay, there are two types of hydrangeas that are well adapted in our area. Okay, this one is called Hydrangea arborescens, and the cultivar name was Annabelle. Okay, so the genus is Hydrangea, the species arborescens. Okay, the reason I bring that up is because I mentioned there are two types, two species of hydrangea that are well adapted, beautiful. Okay, so all of the Hydrangea arborescens with its named cultivars, like Annabelle, they'll all be good for our area. Okay, and this second type that's well adapted, look at this, isn't that beautiful? Look at the kind of cone-shaped flowers. Those are called a panicle type of flower. And so the botanical name for that is Hydrangea paniculata, like panicles, pyramids. That very, very adapted. And there are lots of named varieties of that. Okay, it does beautifully. It likes some sun, a little more sun than the round flowered Annabelle types. Just absolutely beautiful. East side, somewhere where it gets a little bit of sun. But boy, you can't find can't find a shrub, much better than that. Isn't that beautiful? Now, some of the panicle types, again, this is one of the panicle type, paniculata type of hydrangea. Some of them have a little more open, loose flower cluster. So when you're standing at the garden center, the locally owned, well-adapted, the garden centers sell well-adapted material, you're going to see quite a few of these adapted hydrangeas. They differ a little bit in the flower cluster and a little bit in height. Oh, isn't this a beautiful one? This is the one called vanilla strawberry. Again, look at the pyramidal clusters. It's the Hydrangea paniculata, vanilla strawberry. Absolutely beautiful. Now, vanilla strawberry can get, probably 6 or 7 feet tall. There are smaller cultivars of this type as well, with kind of varying. Some are almost lime green in color. Some are very nice ivory. So the garden centers have a lot of these. Some a little bit looser panicle, well adapted, beautiful. Now, here's the reason that it's so important to know those two species that do well. Okay, because introducing a lot of marketing has been the Endless Summer series of hydrangea. And those are the ones with kind of the purple, deep rose pink blossoms, kind of the flat or rounded clustered blossoms. And they're usually marketed in a bright blue or a lavender pot. And these are absolutely beautiful where they're adapted. But we're a little bit borderline in adaptation. And let me tell you why. Okay, in that, see, I should say, first of all, that End of Summer hydrangea, it's a series. There are, I believe, maybe 5 or so now. There's the original Endless Summer, and there's one called Bloomstruck, and about 5 different named ones. Okay, well, here's the Bloomstruck one. Okay, if we look at the botanical name for it, we see it's Hydrangea macrophylla. Okay, and right away that tells me that is a hydrangea that's more closely related to the florist hydrangea. When you go into a grocery store or a flower shop and you see these pretty dark blue or dark pink hydrangeas, that's that species. And so this group of Endless Summer hydrangeas are more closely related to that florist hydrangea. And they don't do as well here in our area because they belong to that species. Okay, now there's a lot of these sold. A few years ago, I took a polling, in the garden column. I asked people, write in, tell me, how have these Endless Summer hydrangea series, how have these done for you? And okay, the responses I got back were this. About 99% of the people said, well, they did really nice the first year, but then they just didn't hardly do anything after that. A small percentage of people said, yeah, they did well. And they planted them in a microclimate. They kept them very moist. They mulched them with wood chips, shredded bark mulch, and they gave them a nice shaded, cool spot. And then in the wintertime, they pulled the wood chips up around them. But if you planted this type of hydrangea, like you did those other two types of hydrangeas, most people didn't have very good luck. So I always like to give caution to that, that in the right spot with the right care, these endless summer hydrangeas can do okay in a sheltered microclimate. The other well-adapted hydrangeas, you don't need to take that extra care with. So again, that was the arborescens types with the great big round blossoms, white, or now there's also some pink. And the panicle type with the big pyramidal clusters, those are well adapted. And then we have this third group that's more like a florist type potted hydrangea. But again, some people have had good success with that by doing certain things with them. So anyway, I hope I didn't lose everybody on a botanical name study here. But again, this is the one type of shrub that I kind of go into this. Okay, now here's a tag on a hydrangea. It called Incredible Bush, Incredible Blush. Okay, and I take a look where the yellow arrow is there, and I see, oh, Hydrangea arborescens. Good. That tells me that that is one of the two well-adapted ones. So see, at the garden center, or if you're at one of the national chains that tend to bring in more types of plants from outside, maybe, you can look at that, look at the fine print down there. So, okay, Hydrangea arborescens, those cultivars would all be adapted. Hydrangea paniculata, those cultivars are going to be adapted. The endless summer types, Hydrangea macrophylla, that's a clue to me that, oh boy, that type is going to have to go in a sheltered spot. I'm going to have to do some special stuff to get that to look good. So anyway, I just want to mention to that because it just indicates that all hydrangeas are not the same, but there are the two species and the cultivars within those that are going to do well for you. All right, let's move on beyond the hydrangea. We're up to the jays, the junipers. Now, creeping junipers. These are the types of evergreens that spread outward. They differ in height that they'll get. Some just hug the ground only a couple inches above ground level and spread outward. Others can get up to maybe a foot in height and then just continue to spread outward. I kind of enjoy the Horticulture Research Farm out by Absaraka, which is 40 miles west or so of Fargo. Each year we have a field day out there. Well, anyway, in the there's an arboretum with about 40 acres of trees and shrubs. And in the juniper section, the creeping juniper, some of those were planted probably 40 years ago. And some of those just keep on going. There are some of the plants that probably originally planted now, gosh, I don't know, they're probably 30, 40 feet spread. So they do keep going, but they're easy to prune. Once a year or so, you can kind of trim them once they reach their spot. But a person should be aware that they do keep spread. So you don't want to put those too close to something else. You want to give them enough space to keep going. Now, some of them are, there's an example of one that stays relatively low. Some have just a beautiful steel blue color. What I enjoy doing in our own landscape is plant some of those that are grass green, the creeping juniper, and some of those that are silver blue. The contrast between the two types is just beautiful. They can even be planted by retaining walls and let them kind of flow over the sides as well. All right. Next, we're on to honeyberry. And the honeyberry is also known as haskap. Now, this is a double duty shrub. There are different heights. It works well as a landscape shrub, but also as a fruit-bearing shrub. Now, this gentleman is showing, some of them get up to, well, even taller than that, maybe 6, 7 feet. Some of the varieties only get up to about 4 feet. But the local garden centers will have tags on them that tell you how high. But they produce just a wonderful, wonderful fruit, fully winter hardy. They love our soil. So it's not a finicky type thing like the blueberries would be in North Dakota, but well adapted. You do need 2 different named varieties for pollination on these. So 2 different named varieties. The garden centers, local garden centers can help choose the 2 varieties so that you get good fruit. Next, we go on to mock orange. Mock orange, Philadelphus is the genus, but mock orange, I think the name, the common name probably developed from because they look kind of like orange blossoms, the blossoms off of an orange tree, a citrus tree, but just a beautiful spring blooming, late spring, early summer blooming shrub. They can get quite tall. Probably 6 feet, 7 feet. It depends how you trim them. But a beautiful, beautiful, fragrant blossom. Even though the blossoms don't last all summer, it'd be nice if they did. But even so, just when those shrubs are coming into bloom and the fragrance, it's certainly worth it, even if the blossoms are maybe only 2 weeks or so. For that 2 weeks, they're beautiful. Next, we move on to ninebark. Ninebarks is a big group of shrubs. You see here, the ones that are kind of a lime green, and this variety, kind of can't tell quite from the photo, but they're probably about 6 feet tall. There are shorter types. So in this ninebark group, there are a lot of different named cultivars. Fully winter hardy, they make a nice rounded shrub, kind of an informal. One of my favorite types is one called Amber Jubilee ninebark. And this was developed in Canada, and it was named to commemorate Elizabeth's Jubilee, her golden Jubilee, Amber Jubilee ninebark. One of my favorites. The color, this is not the fall color of it. This is the color of it during the growing season. You have multiple shades of color on those, kind of coppery colored. And of course, it becomes very pretty in the fall too. But there's a lot of nice color going on even during the growing season. And they're beautiful, kind of light green, lemony green, such as the lemon candy. So at the garden center, you're going to see quite a number of different named cultivars. Here's a red leaf, a purple leaf variety called Summer Wine. And there's a miniature version of that one called Tiny Wine. They do produce nice flowers for probably a 2-week period during the growing season. But even when they're not in flower, the foliage is so beautiful on ninebarks. And here is a dwarf blue spruce that makes such a nice accent in a shrub border. And when I say shrub border, usually shrubs just look nice in association with others. Instead of just kind of one isolated shrub by itself, don't they look nice in combination with other things? And the dwarf blue spruce, and you'll find named varieties of them, the dwarf blue spruce kind of grows like a globe-shaped, our typical blue spruce is the pyramidal Christmas tree type, but these form a nice rounded mound, and the contrasting silver blue foliage looks so nice in combination with other shrubs. And as long as we're talking about evergreens, the mugo pine, longer needled, than the spruce and the junipers, longer needled pine, and a shrub type pine rather than a Christmas tree looking pine. And there are some varieties that have tighter growth, not quite so unruly. But so some of the garden centers you'll find will have the more dwarf form of mugo pine. Again, always check the eventual height on those, mugo pine. Potentilla, the yellowed flowered shrub. My favorite is, and not just because it was developed at NDSU, but because it's the best potentilla that I have ever seen. And that's the one called Dakota Sunspot. It was developed, it was selected from a potentilla that was growing out in the Badlands of North Dakota. Dakota sunspot, what makes that so nice is it has a nice, neat plant habit, but it has a larger size yellow blossom. And it doesn't get quite so kind of overgrown like potentillas do. It's still every, maybe 3 or 4 years, does like a fairly hard prune back to let fresh new growth come. Dakota sunspot potentilla. That's my favorite of those. There are other named varieties too that you'd find at garden centers, but the yellow-flowered potentilla, if you're looking for something that does beautifully in a hot, sunny location, this is it. Next, azaleas and rhododendrons. Well, wow, isn't that kind of something for the South? But there are some azaleas and rhododendrons that have been developed for the North. For example, University of Minnesota developed the Northern Lights series. So you'll find names like Rosy Lights and Pink Lights and Northern Lights and lots of different lights series. White Lights, I believe, is probably one of them. Okay, and a closely related plant to the azalea is the rhododendron. And there is a rhododendron that is winter hardy in zones 3 and 4 called PJM rhododendron. Isn't that pretty? Now, the azaleas and rhododendrons bloom in early spring before the leaves really come out. Now, rhododendron is actually the leaves hang on, but before much new growth starts, the flowers are out. On the azaleas, the flowers do come out before the leaves. So in springtime, early spring, they're quite dramatic because those flowers really stand out on the branches. Now, the azaleas and rhododendrons aren't something you'd maybe plant on an exposed hillside. They're best planted in a microclimate. And a microclimate is somewhere in your yard, especially an established yard where you've got some protection from trees or other large shrubs, protection from the wind. Maybe the snow filters in better, it gives it some good snow insulation, and a spot that isn't so open just to the elements and the hot sun and the drying wind, but a microclimate. But PJM rhododendron, beautiful. Next, we go to staghorn sumac. Now, sumac, of course, gets fairly large, well over head high, and sumac does sucker and spread out, but what a great spot for somewhere where you can use that to advantage. If you've got a spot where you don't mind if it kind of spreads and fills in, then sumac is a great choice. And there's a variety, cultivar, named tiger eye sumac. It has that brilliant golden green color and kind of that lacy texture. Isn't that beautiful? And then, of course, in the fall of the year, it gives that bright, vibrant orange color. Tiger eye sumac. Yeah, that's always pretty at the garden centers, but a person does need to plant it somewhere where you don't mind where the little sumacs are going to be coming up around it. So use that to its advantage in the right location. Next, we have currants and gooseberries. They're nice landscape shrubs too, and they produce edible fruit. The currant and gooseberries. The gooseberry is the one on the left, and the currant is the red. All right, next we have alpine currant. Now, alpine currant does not produce fruit, but it's in that same family. It produces a very nice hedge, either informal like this, or you can trim it. We have alpine currant hedge in front of our house in kind of a circular fashion. They trim very, very well, fully winter hardy. And so alpine currant is also a nice choice for a hedge. If you did no trimming, they can get probably up to easily 5 feet high, I suppose. And trimming, you can keep them at whatever height you'd like. All right, roses. Certainly had to toss in some roses because they're certainly usable for shrubs. The one on the left, I should have put the name on that. The one on the left is called Hope for Humanity. It's a Canadian shrub roses. The Canadians have done a lot of work on roses. So anytime I get one, we want to add roses to our landscape. I look for those developed in Canada because they did a lot of winter hardy searching for good types. And the one on the right is one of my favorites called Morden Sunrise. There's a whole Morden series, Morden Blush, Morden Bell, this one, Morden Sunrise, from Morden, Manitoba, where they were developed. And here's another one of my favorites called the Campfire Rose. Campfire Rose blooms for most of the summertime, and it's fascinating. It was developed fascinating because it has so many different colors of flowers all on the same shrub. They'll open up kind of that yellowish with some pink blush, and then they'll develop deeper colors. So Campfire Rose, sold at local garden centers. Beautiful. All right, then we're botanic name-wise, we're up to the S's, Sorberia. This is one called false spirea. It's not actually a spirea, but some of the blossoms kind of look like a spirea. So I suppose that's where they get the false spirea. It develops kind of a lacy-like shrub look. Ours is, I suppose, with age, it's a good 5 feet, maybe even up to 6 feet in height. In the fall of the year, they develop a very nice scarlet color. And they do have flowers, the flowers there that you see in white, a very nice blossom as well. All right, next we go to the true spireas. Now there's many cultivars of spireas and they differ in height, but notice this type, this might be lime mound, but anyway, when you're at the garden center, you'll see all kinds of different names of these spireas, such as these with kind of the light yellowish, lime-colored foliage, a neat rounded mound. Or this is one of my favorites, Little Princess Spirea. They have lavender blossoms bloom for a good share of the summertime. They form a low-growing kind of squat-shaped mound. This probably, let's see, maybe 2.5 feet tall and can get a good 3 feet or so wide. Little Princess Spirea. Then there are other types of spireas too that you'll see at the garden centers. One is called Double Play. One that's been around a long time is Anthony Water and Gold Flame. And so again, check the heights of those, but they bloom for a nice chunk of the summertime, midsummer or so. They prune nicely. And now here is one that's been around a long time. That's the Bridal Wreath Spirea. Bridal Wreath Spirea. An older name for it was the Van Hoot Spirea. And they bloom in May, late spring, early summer, with those arching fronds of flowers. They do bloom just at that time in late spring, early summer. But boy, very beautiful when they are in bloom. And a nice, neat shrub after that. Next, we go to the lilacs. Of course, we've got the old-fashioned lilac. And this one is called dwarf Korean lilac. Now, dwarf is kind of, a dwarf doesn't necessarily mean real tiny, but it's dwarf compared to the old-fashioned. The old-fashioned lilac can get great big, 15, 18 feet tall in time. The dwarf Korean lilac, maybe 6 or 7 feet high, 6 or 7 feet wide, probably at least 7 feet high. And if you take a look, there are some little shorter versions of things. There's a neat novel lilac that developed a number of years ago called Bloomerang. Bloomerang. The reason it's called that is because it doesn't bloom only in the spring. It will also bloom later in the summer. It's a repeat bloomer. Now, it doesn't do that every year. I've noticed that ours, kind of depending on the conditions, if it's too hot, too dry during the summer, then it seems we don't get much late summer bloom on it. But it is capable of giving you a second flush of blossoms, usually not quite as heavy as the early summer flush. But it's kind of fun to have some flowers on a lilac later in the year as well. All right, next we've got an evergreen called Yew, Y-E-W. And this is a very soft evergreen, and you can run your hands along. This is an evergreen that does very well in shade or like the east side. It does not like the hot brunt of the south sun quite as much. But if you've got a spot on the east or maybe even the north side where you'd like a shrub, an evergreen, the yew will do that. And garden centers have a number of named varieties like most of these. All right, so as long as we're talking about arborvitae, let's take a look at, or as long as we're talking about evergreens, let's look at arborvitae. Now, arborvitae are the evergreens with the flat foliage. And so if you kind of concentrate in on that, you'll notice that rather than having like a needle-like, they're flat, nice and soft and flat. Now, there are different types of arborvitae. There are the round globe arborvitaes, and there are the pyramidal arborvitaes. So different growth habits. And so again, check the tags, especially on the globe arborvitaes. Some globe arborvitaes are very tiny and maybe won't get more than 3 feet high, 3 feet wide. Other globe arborvitaes will get 6 feet high or more and 6 feet wide. Great big globes. Always so pretty. All right, we're up to the V's. Viburnum. This is the American cranberry viburnum. Beautiful flowers in the spring, early summer, and followed by berries in the fall of the year. Now, the high bush cranberry, the cranberry bush viburnum, the fruit are awfully tart. I've sampled them kind of after they get a little frost, then they're maybe a little sweeter, but excellent jellies. So the Viburnum group, and there are a number of different species and named varieties. Some are quite low, some are, head high or more. So the Viburnum group. The Viburnum group likes shade or can do well in shade. So if you've got a shaded spot, you might consider Viburnum. Next is another one of those names that is a little hard to pronounce. It's Weigela. Weigela. Some people just from looking at it, it looks like, gosh, it looks like Wiglia. We've heard that a lot. My wife Mary and I had a garden center for about 25 years, and it kind of does look like you'd pronounce it Wiglia. But anyway, it's Weigela. There are a couple of different flower colors. There's a purple cultivar, and this red prince is a common one, and there are others as well. And a beautiful excuse me, a beautiful flowering shrub, flowers in midsummer or so, have a fairly long blooming period. Every so often they should be rejuvenated. And when I say rejuvenated, they get kind of old and woody and need to be cut back in early spring and allowed to regrow because the fresh growth will be more capable of having nice blossoms once again. That's an advantage of some of these deciduous shrubs. We can rejuvenate them by cutting them back before they leaf out in spring and letting the new growth regrow. Now, here's one that I added in just because it is so novel. It's called smoke bush, or also called smoke tree. It's another one of those where is it a shrub or is it a tree? Well, at any rate, it's very unusual because the kind of flowers and seed pods look like these kind of floating puffs of smoke. So smoke bush or smoke tree, and very, very beautiful. They do tend to be a little bit borderline hardiness. So shop the local garden centers for the ones that are best adapted to us. So anyway, a large shrub. We have a purple version of it at our home. And because they're a little borderline in hardiness, it keeps freezing back. It keeps growing from the base, but it doesn't quite get big enough to smoke. So anyway, I should have chosen one that was a little more winter hardy at one of our local garden centers, but very unique. Now here's one that a person sees sold very, very commonly at especially the national chains. It's called dwarf Alberta spruce. Dwarf Alberta spruce. It is not very well adapted because it usually ends up looking after a few years like the one on the right. It may grow nicely for a couple of years, but more often than not, they winter burn quite badly. So, it might be worth it to avoid dwarf Alberta spruce. Now, test time. Now, don't everybody bail out. The test is really, really easy. If you've done these webinars before, we simply collect a few things we ask, because this does help us with our webinars to plan them. It asks if did you learn anything that you can use? And then we get the demographics such as age to make sure that we're reaching a widespread audience. Plus, we've got a little bit left of the program after this. So, okay, thank you. Let's end the poll. I really appreciate that. And now let's continue on with the rest of the program here. Okay, let's talk about a couple of NDSU introductions, because the Woody Plants Improvement Program at NDSU selects trees and shrubs that are specially suited to our area. Okay, and here is one that's absolutely beautiful. Spring Welcome Magnolia. Whoever thought we could grow magnolias? I mean, that's like for South Carolina or Georgia. But Spring Welcome Magnolia is fully hardy into zone 3. The blossoms come out before the leaves. Isn't that beautiful against the blue sky? Spring Welcome Magnolia. And locally owned garden centers, you aren't going to find it everywhere, but ask for it, and it will become more popular as time goes on. Makes a beautiful, nice landscape shrub and wonderful flowers. And the azaleas that we mentioned, NDSU has one called Fire Flare. Fire Flare Orange Mollis Azalea. Isn't that pretty? Beautiful. And that'll be blooming in early spring. All right, this is a very poor picture. It's called Blueberry Delight Juniper. It's a spreading creeping juniper, and my wife and I have one of these in front of our house as well. Now, the reason it's called Blueberry Delight is because it has beautiful little blueberries. Those are the fruits of juniper, little kind of like little blueberries, and it becomes so decorative. It's got nice kind of silvery green foliage, and then it will become covered with those little blueberries. It was discovered out in western North Dakota also. All right, and Fireglow Amber Maple, great big mound-shaped shrub. Let's see, I suppose this easily gets, I bet it's probably 8 to 10 feet tall, just one great big, but imagine planting that kind of somewhere where you want some screening, and in the fall of the year, that beautiful, beautiful color. And there's a mugo pine that grows into kind of a pyramidal shape called Highland Splendor. That would be a nice evergreen. It becomes about 15 to 18 feet tall. That'd be a nice evergreen for screening. All right. And I wanted to mention our Growing Together a Gardening podcast. If you enjoy listening to gardening podcasts while you're doing something else, if you just search for that, it's on Spotify and Apple and a few other things. And always feel free to email me. And while I'm leaving that, let's take a look at some questions. And again, thank you all very much. In case anybody needs to tune out, I really appreciate all of you who joined in. Very nice group tonight. So let's take a look at these questions. Okay, is Hot Wings Tatarian maple native? The Tatarian maple is native, and so the Hot Wings is a cultivar of the a native tree. Can you mention which shrubs will grow in part to full shade? Okay, part to full shade, you'd have the hydrangeas and the viburnums. And in both of those groups, there are quite a few cultivars. So that gives you quite a few choices. So shade, viburnum, and the hydrangeas are two good choices. We have a row of chokecherry trees in our shelter that are randomly dying. Any suggestions on how to restore versus cutting them down? Chokecherry are very susceptible to black knot fungus disease, which could be why they're dying. Chokecherry will develop problems after maybe 20, 25 years. And so there is probably not a good way to restore without cutting down and getting them to rejuvenate. All right, when you say cut back, how far? Okay, like on a On a shrub, when a person is going to rejuvenate, cutting back means cutting it down to about 4 to 6 inches above ground level and forcing all new growth from the base versus just a little bit of light trimming on the back. So cutting back means way down 4 to 6 inches above. Is witch hazel a good shrub tree for this area? You know, witch hazel, to be honest with you, I'm not real familiar with witch hazel. I'd have to do some checking on that. Many of these things, such as witch hazel, I believe witch hazel might be a little borderline. The genus of that is Hamamelis, and I'd have to do a little checking. And there's a reason why we don't see a lot of those around usually. If we don't see a whole lot around, it usually means that they're not totally adapted. But I'd have to do a little checking on witch hazel. But yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. Sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that. Okay, thanks for the closed caption. You're very welcome. We tend to have rabbits chew in our garden. What bushes are less likely to be eaten by rabbits? None of them. The reason I say that kind of tongue in cheek, because if the rabbits are hungry enough, they've been almost known to go after everything. The things that they prefer are the burning bush euonymus. They love those. They love spirea. They love roses. They love arborvitae. And so what bushes are less likely to be eaten by rabbits? I mentioned that globe carigana. That is a really nice one. The rabbits don't seem to prefer that. The viburnums are probably less apt to be eaten by rabbits. On the good side, the spireas and things, when the rabbits chew them, they usually come back better than ever. But it's a challenge. Rabbit-proof plants. If the rabbits are hungry enough, I'm afraid they'll kind of go over everything. Don't azaleas need acid soil? Those developed for northern areas don't require the acid soil that the azaleas grown out east do. The natural azalea territory out east and down south is acid soil. What the azaleas and rhododendrons like in our area would be to have peat moss amended or an organic material. They aren't real fond of our alkaline soils, but they'll tolerate it. And so the need for acid soil isn't a deal breaker, but they would like some organic material added. Peat moss, which will also give a little bit of acidity too. Yeah, thank you. Does arborvitae have a tendency to winter burn? They can. Arborvitae, if they're in a spot that's a little bit windswept, or if it's catching the snow, reflection from the snow, the sun off of the snow. Arborvitae can winter burn. Most evergreens, unfortunately, can. It doesn't happen so often that it limits their planting. Some people on their arborvitae will put a screening of burlap to help prevent the wind burn and the sunburn. Okay, great. Have paniculata hydrangea plants not many blooms? West side of the house. Why doesn't it bloom much? The strawberry vanilla cultivars. The hydrangeas, the panicle types, take a number of years to kind of really get going, 3 or 4 years. The west side of the house could be a little bit hot in the afternoon. They'd probably prefer an east side, but if the west side is kind of where you have those, try a couple of things. Mulch them with shredded bark to keep the soil a little bit cooler and also make sure that they're getting enough moisture. Hydrangea means water loving. And also maybe give them in the first half of the growing season, give them some good water-soluble fertilizer. Also try that. How do you trim hydrangea, the panicle type of hydrangeas? The owners of my home cut little lamb to 4 inches and ruined it. Yeah, the pruning on the two types of hydrangeas, the arborescens type with the big round white flowers or pink flowers, those die back to near ground level, or maybe 6 inches or so. So that type in the spring of the year, you cut way, way back to, 4 to 6 inches above ground level. The panicle type with the pyramidal flower clusters don't die back all the way each year. They behave more like what I call a normal shrub. They leaf out from the above ground branches. So you don't cut those all the way back like the other hydrangeas. So in the spring of the year, you just cut back any of the old flower remnants, maybe just trim it or shape it a little bit to keep it at the height you'd like. And so there isn't the hard cutback that you would like with the arborescens hydrangeas. Can you trim or cut back yews? If so, when? Yes, the yew evergreens trim quite nicely. And the time for cutting those back is during the growing season instead of the dormant season. But when they're actively growing, the yews can be cut back. So May, June would be good time to trim back yews. Make sure you don't go back too far in. Like most evergreens, if you went too far back into the woody branches, they aren't able to regenerate new growth. So usually you should just stay in kind of the nice, healthy, where there's still good green material on the outside. Sumac in the high clay soil, good or bad? Sumac will grow beautifully even in our our clay soil. They're so prolific that they'll go for road ditches or almost anywhere. So yep, sumac would tolerate the high clay. Found this at witch hazel, one type of fascinating. Thank you. Witch halis, yeah, hamamelis. Let's see what it says about, hardiness zone 3 to 8. Wonder why we don't see more of those. Looks kind of pretty. Huh. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. Yeah, well, it's a good day. Count the day lost. You don't learn something new. And I had kind of forgotten or didn't really know that much about witch hazel, but it looks like witch hazel is hardy, plenty hardy enough. I wonder why we don't see more of it. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. My dad has a couple of pyramidal arborvitaes near his house, which are way too tall. Yeah, common problem 25, 30, 40 years ago was to plant pyramidal arborvitae near the corners of the house, and then they get way, way too tall, especially on a single-story house. How and when should you reduce the size if possible? Well, it'll probably look kind of like a flat-topped pyramid when it's done. I have seen them cut back down to kind of the point you want to get them back down to. And the time in May, when they've started actively growing. Evergreens, rather than doing them during the dormant season like deciduous trees and shrubs, we do it during the growing season. And arborvitaes, really the first half of the growing season. So a big cutback like that, I believe I would do in probably in May. Okay, thanks for the kind words. Yeah, I'll have another webinar 1 week from tonight on containers, how to get more mileage out of your flowering containers. Next question, will an Amur maple as a replacement adapt to the same location of a struggling river birch? Yeah, Amur maple, you should be able to replace a struggling birch with an Amur maple. Amur maple can be subject to iron chlorosis in some soil, so just watch it and add a little iron if you do need. Okay, let's see. Now let's take a look at the other side here. Is it only pruning that differentiates the shrub form from the tree form of Amur maple? Yeah, basically it was the way that the nurseries started them from the onset, whether they trained it to just kind of more tree type, or they cut it back way back so that a whole bunch of branches. So the pruning is the main thing, but there are different cultivars of Amur maple that lend themselves to the shrub form. So the answer is kind of both. There are shrub cultivars that kind of stay more like a shrub, but it does depend on how you prune them too. Is Amur maple still good in Grand Forks? A lot more clay. Yeah, and yeah, both Fargo and Grand Forks. Yeah, we should have a challenge as to which of us has the worst clay. Amur maple does well in clay, but if you notice any yellowing, it's usually the response to iron in our heavy clay, lack of iron or inefficiency of iron. But there's lots of Amur maple growing in Fargo in very heavy soil, clay soil. I do not like the wings on maples. Does the Amur maple have that? Amur maple does. So sometimes you do get little maples sprouting up, but I've never heard people complaining about Amur maples the way they do other type of maples, where you have little maples coming up all over in your flower garden. But I think most Amur maples probably are not seedless. Does an aronia need trimming? Trimming, it will grow. If you don't do any trimming, it'll grow up to probably around 5 feet high, 5 feet wide. And so it would work for the corner of the house, yes. And the birds eat the berries, right? Well, one advantage of the aronia is that the birds don't seem to bother the berries. I don't know if that's good or bad. But yeah, they don't seem to be palatable to birds. And so I never have to net them the way a person would Juneberry or other berries. And so, yeah, aronia would be good for the corner of the house. Isn't euonymus invasive in the east? Yes, some of the euonymus are invasive in the east. There's cautions against planting them in many of the eastern states, the eastern half probably of United States. Are there any potential problems with invasiveness in North Dakota? With euonymus, we aren't under any type of a watch that they would become, and it's probably because the rabbits eat them so voraciously that I don't think that euonymus would ever have a prayer against the rabbits. And yeah, but you are totally right. I'm not sure how I suppose they grow so invasively in the east that they just even outdo the rabbits. Yeah, and the other comment, I think the burning bush is being phased out in Minnesota. And that could very well be that is being put on kind of a warning list. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I have seen that caution. So yeah, so apparently it's starting kind of in Minnesota and on east then, that the winged burning bush, the euonymus group, is being regulated. Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting. At a point, Red River Valley and on west, the soil changes greatly. And yeah, so it'll be interesting if North Dakota is, I think with our prairie soil, the euonymus probably would not take off the way it does from that forested point on east. So it's interesting, yeah, but apparently in Minnesota, it is, like you say, Brenda. Let's see, not sure your first name, but yeah, that's a good point. Okay, Cindy says, I heard vanilla strawberry wouldn't do well here. I know the endless summer does not. Yeah, but vanilla strawberry being a panicle one, and give it good moisture, kind of a protected spot. The vanilla strawberry does beautifully in Fargo, fully winter hardy. And so Cindy, if you're in Grand Forks, it'd be interesting how it's doing up there, but it seems to be fully winter hardy for our zones 3. In the Minnesota metro area, endless summer has been nicknamed endless bummer. They don't do well in the Minnesota metro. Yeah, I didn't want to use that term, but yes. Old Professor Neil Holland say, well, it's not endless summer, it should be named endless bummer. How do you keep the weeds out of creeping juniper? Weeds out of creeping juniper, you could try pre-emergence like preen, but if the weeds are already established like dandelions, it's pretty much means a person has to hand dig. Can you cut 9 barks back quite low? Yes, 9 barks, when they get old and woody, can be cut back to about 4 to 6 inches above ground, and in 99% of the time, they'll come back. There's always that one exception. I've had powdery mildew with some of my 9 barks. Yeah. I had great airflow. 9 barks can be susceptible to the gray powdery mildew. Some of the newer varieties are less susceptible. So check the tags for one that says mildew resistant. And because I think some of them are being developed now. Is dwarf blue spruce subject to needle cast infections? I lost an old blue spruce just this year. The dwarf blue spruce I believe it would probably get it. I've never seen a dwarf blue spruce that started losing needles to needle cast, but it's in that same species. So I don't believe it's probably resistant. It would probably come down to it. Although just because of its small size, I've never seen it affected with needle cast, but I doubt it's resistant. Do all the Potentillas like the hard cutback every 3 to 4 years? Well, what I do with the Potentillas is watch and see if they become quite woody and they're just no longer looking nice and they don't bloom as well. Then yeah, most of the varieties do seem to enjoy every 3 to 4 years being rejuvenated fresh again. Technical name for the long blooming shrub roses. Yeah, exactly. They're shrub roses, kind of the common name, shrub roses versus the hybrid tea, which are the tender roses. Yep, so at the garden centers, you'll oftentimes see the group of called shrub roses or hardy shrub roses. With the drought continuing, struggling with vintage bridal wreath spirea. Should put in a drip system. Yeah, bridal wreath spirea isn't overly drought tolerant, so adding extra water. You might also, if the grass is encroaching, grass is a big water hog. So if you can, I would put shredded mulch, maybe landscape fabric on either side, and then shredded mulch around alongside the hedge. If you can, that'll keep the grass away and it'll help conserve moisture. Bridal wreath spirea, a certain lifespan, they can last very, very well, but every number of years on those, they do like a good cutback and a rejuvenation. Been there 30 years. You know, bridal wreath spirea probably don't have to be cut back as often as like a potentilla, but I'd say probably every 10 years, maybe. So hopefully yours could be rejuvenated. Can you trim yews? Yep, that would be during the growing season, first half of the summer. Winterberry, are they deer resistant? Might be worth a try. You know, there's a lot of shrubs such as the winterberry that I didn't include. It's possible that the winterberry might be deer resistant, but again, I also hate to hesitate to say anything's deer resistant because I'm sure for somebody it has even the winterberry has been eaten. Would wrapping the dwarf elder spruce for winter make difference? It would. Dwarf elder spruce could be wrapped religiously every year to prevent the winter burn, and that might help. But again, it's the type of thing that if you didn't do that, chances are it would winter burn. There are very few, I know there's probably a couple of exceptions, but for every dwarf Alberta spruce that is living, there's 99% of the others didn't make it. When should we trim a dogwood? In early spring, while they're still dormant is the best time for dogwoods and other deciduous. Okay, and someone mentioned that this is the third, missing another one. Okay, to everyone that registered, I'll send out all 3 recordings after this of all 3. Is there a Japanese lilac? Yes, that's the Japanese tree lilac. Japanese tree lilac is the usual one called Japanese. Is there a place to see all NDSU releases? Yep, if you do an online search, just NDSU woody plant releases, you should be able to find the list. Okay, yep, you're right. Burning bush is banned in some states, and that's because it does seed. It will seed itself. Again, I'm not seeing anything remotely like that happening in North Dakota, but North Dakota starts the prairie type soil conditions. But burning bush will spread by seed. So in the eastern half of the United States, and sounds like in Minnesota too, it's under regulation. Nanking cherry, how long do they live? Nanking cherry, the Prunus group is a little short-lived. A Nanking cherry, maybe after 15 years, roughly, that might be about the end of their life. Even plum trees in our area, 12, 15, 20 years. How much sun do panicle hydrangeas need? Panicle hydrangeas prefers a little bit of sun rather than full shade. So panicle type hydrangeas would like maybe the east side of the house where they get some sunshine, such as half day of sunshine. Okay, we're just about wrapping up. Chokecherry bushes, would like to remove them. What is the best way to go about that? Chokecherry, if you cut them down, just as they're starting to grow in the spring, cut them down at ground level and apply a little bit of lawn weed herbicide to the cut stump. Okay, I think we're just about done. If the birds don't eat aronia berries, that should be a clue. Yeah. I don't know why the birds don't eat them, but again, I eat them fresh out of hand. They'll pucker you up a little, but yeah, most of ours go into muffins and other cooking. Yes. Yeah, even the birds must think they're a little bit tart, but that saves the antioxidants for Mary and I and our family. Well, thank you all very much. The recording, once it's created, I will send it out because there were about 300 some that actually registered and about half that attended live. So we will see that all the registrants get the recording of this. And then also it will include the 2 previous, this being the 3rd night. So thank you all very much and have a very, very good evening. Thanks again for joining. Good night.